The crimson sun hung low over the Montana territory like a wound in the sky, casting long shadows across Samuel Hartwell's weathered ranch. The autumn of 1882 had been particularly harsh, with early snows followed by unseasonable warmth that left the prairie grass brittle and yellow. Samuel stood on his porch, calloused hands gripping the wooden rail as he surveyed his domain, 300 acres of hard-won land that had cost him everything he'd saved from his years as a railroad worker back in Illinois. Another one's missing, called his eldest son Tommy, as he jogged back from the eastern pasture. At 15, the boy had grown tall and lean like his father, with the same determined jaw and honest blue eyes that had won Martha's heart 24 years ago. But now, those eyes held worry beyond his years. Samuel's stomach clenched. Which one? Bessie. Found blood by the creek and her calves bawling something fierce. Tommy removed his hat and ran a hand through his sandy hair. Papa, that's 7 head in 2 weeks. We can't keep losing cattle like this. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. 7 cattle meant nearly $200, money they desperately needed to pay the mortgage to Millbrook Savings and Loan. He'd borrowed against the ranch to buy breeding stock, betting everything on building the finest herd in Lewis County. Now that gamble seemed destined to destroy everything he'd worked to build. Did you see any sign of what took her? Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. The tracks around his water sources told a story written in mud and blood. A pack of wolves had claimed his land as their hunting ground. Big paw prints leading north toward Devil's Canyon. And Papa! Tommy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I heard them howling again last night. Sounded like they were right outside my window. Martha appeared in the doorway, her flour-dusted apron and worried expression making her look older than her 41 years. Supper's getting cold, she said, but her eyes were fixed on her husband's face, reading the defeat there. Samuel, what are we going to do? Before he could answer, the sound that had haunted their nights for weeks drifted across the prairie. Long, mournful howl that seemed to carry all the wildness and hunger of the untamed frontier. It was answered by another, then another, until the very air seemed to throb with primitive menace. Little Emma, barely 7 years old, pressed closer to her mother's skirts. Mama, are the wolves going to eat us? Martha's arms encircled her daughter protectively, but her eyes remained fixed on Samuel. In their depths, he saw the question she was too proud to voice. What kind of man lets wolves steal his family's future? That night, Samuel sat in the parlor cleaning his old hunting rifle, a Springfield trapdoor he'd carried during his brief service in the Indian Wars. The weapon had served him well against hostile Sioux warriors, but wolves were different. They hunted in packs, thought like military strategists, and showed no mercy to those who threatened their territory. You thinking of going after them? Martha asked, as she mended Tommy's torn shirt by lamplight. Don't see as I have much choice. Sheriff Coleman's got his hands full with cattle rustlers, and we can't afford to hire professional hunters. Samuel worked a patch down the rifle barrel, the familiar motions helping to calm his nerves. Maybe if I can get 1 or 2 of them, the rest will move on. Martha set down her sewing and fixed him with the look that had made him fall in love with her all those years ago. Equal parts, strength and tenderness. Samuel Hartwell, you're a good man and a fine father, but you're no wolf hunter. Those beasts have been killing for sport, not just food. They've developed a taste for easy prey, and that makes them more dangerous than any outlaw. She was right, and they both knew it. Samuel was a farmer, skilled with plow and harness, hammer and saw, but hunting wolves required different skills, patience, cunning, and a willingness to think like a predator. Still, what choice did he have? The answer came 3 days later, delivered by young Billy Patterson, who worked part-time for the telegraph office in Millbrook. The boy rode his pinto mare hard across the prairie, kicking up clouds of dust that announced his arrival long before Samuel could make out his features. Mr. Hartwell, got a telegram for you, Billy called out, waving a yellow paper above his head. Came in on the morning wire from Fort Benton. Samuel accepted the telegram with trembling fingers, his heart racing as he read the brief message. Heard. About wolf problem stop. Jack Morrison available. Stop arriving Thursday. Stop $50 plus expenses stop. The telegram was unsigned, but Samuel knew the sender had to be his brother-in-law, Frank, who worked as a freight supervisor at the fort. Frank had connections throughout the territory and a talent for finding solutions to impossible problems. "Who's Jack Morrison, Papa?" Tommy asked, reading over his father's shoulder. Samuel wasn't sure, but the name stirred memories of campfire. Stories and saloon gossip, tales of a man who could track anything that walked, crawled, or flew across the frontier. Some called him the Wolf Hunter, others simply referred to him as Morrison. All agreed on two things: he was deadly effective and he wasn't cheap. $50 was a fortune, more than Samuel earned in 3 months of back-breaking work. But as another cow lowed pitifully from the direction of the creek, he realized he might not have any choice. Thursday dawned grey and cold, with low clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Samuel had spent the morning reinforcing the cattle, pen with additional boards and wire, though he suspected it would make little difference. The wolves had proven remarkably adept at finding weaknesses in his defenses. He was hammering the last nail when Martha called from the house. "Samuel, rider coming!" The figure approaching from the east sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. Even at a distance, something about his posture suggested coiled readiness, like a rattlesnake warming itself on a sunny rock. As he drew closer, Samuel could make out more details. A tall, lean man in his 30s, dressed in black woolen leather, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. 2 rifles hung from his saddle, a lever-action Winchester and what looked like a custom-built long gun with brass fittings. A Colt .45 rode low on his right hip, its holster worn smooth by countless draws, but it was his eyes that commanded. Attention when he finally looked up, pale grey like winter ice and utterly without warmth. "You'd be Samuel Hartwell," the stranger said. It wasn't a question, "and you'd be Jack Morrison." Samuel set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his pants. "Frank sent you?" Morrison nodded and dismounted in one fluid motion. His black gelding was a magnificent animal, clearly bred for both speed and endurance. "Frank said you've got a wolf problem. 7 pack, from what I hear. 8 now. Lost another one yesterday." Samuel gestured toward the damaged fence. "They're getting bolder. Last night they came within 50 yards of the house." Morrison walked over to examine the fence, his movements precise and economical. He knelt by a section where the wolves had obviously tested the barriers, studying the claw marks and tooth impressions left in the wood. "Big pack," he murmured, more to himself than to Samuel. "Alpha males probably pushing 200 pounds. Been hunting together for years, by the look of their coordination." He stood and dusted off his hands. "This isn't random predation. They've marked this territory as theirs." "Can you stop them?" Morrison's smile was cold as a January wind. "Mr. Hartwell, I've killed wolves from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande, grizzlies, mountain lions, even a rogue buffalo that was goring homesteaders near Billings. The question isn't whether I can stop them, it's whether you're willing to pay what it costs. $50 plus expenses. That what Frank told you I agreed to? That's the rate for a standard job, but this." Morrison gestured toward the damaged fence and the blood-stained ground beyond. "This is a war pack. They've killed for sport, established dominance over human territory. Dealing with them requires different methods. $75. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. $75 might as well have been 1,000. He simply didn't have it. But before he could respond, Martha appeared at his elbow, her face set in determined lines. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, "we can give you 25 now and work off the rest. My husband's skilled with carpentry and metalwork. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. Our boy Tommy's strong for his age and willing to work." Morrison studied her with those unsettling eyes, and Samuel saw something shift in his expression. Not softness exactly, but perhaps recognition of desperate honesty. "Mrs. Hartwell, I appreciate the offer, but I don't typically accept payment plans." "Then we'll lose everything," Martha said simply. "The banknote's due in 6 weeks. Without our cattle, we can't pay. We'll lose the ranch, and my children will grow up knowing their father couldn't protect what was theirs." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of the surviving cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Finally, Morrison nodded. 25 now, the rest when the job's done. But I work alone, and I do things my way. No interference, no questions about my methods." He paused, fixing Samuel with that Arctic stare. "And if any of your family gets hurt because they didn't follow my instructions, that's on you, not me." Morrison spent the first day studying the ranch like a general surveying a battlefield. He walked every fence line, examined every water source, and identified the game trails the wolves used to move across the property. Samuel watched him work. With growing respect and unease, the man moved through the landscape like he was reading a book written in tracks and scent marks. "They're using the old buffalo wallow as a gathering point," Morrison explained that evening, as they stood in the barn. He had spread a hand-drawn map of the property across a hay bale, marking locations with pieces of charcoal. "Alpha pair sleeps here, in the rocks above Devil's Canyon. The younger ones range wider, but they all come back to this central area." Tommy had been following Morrison around like a lost puppy, fascinated by the hunter's equipment and expertise. "How do you know all that just from looking at tracks?" Morrison glanced at the boy, and Samuel caught a flicker of something almost paternal in those cold eyes. "Wolves are smart, son, but they're also creatures of habit. They mark territory, establish routines, follow the same paths night after night. Learn to read the sign, and you can predict where they'll be." He pointed to several locations on his crude map. "I'll set up a rotation of positions. Never hunt from the same spot twice. Never let them establish a pattern for my behavior. The key to hunting pack animals is disrupting their sense of security." "What about traps?" Samuel asked. "I've got some old beaver traps in the shed." Morrison shook his head. "Traps work on individual animals, but a pack this smart will learn to avoid them after the first casualty. No, this requires active hunting, patience, skill, and the willingness to think like they do." That night, Morrison took up position in the hayloft with his custom rifle, a weapon he'd had built by a German gunsmith in Denver. The stock was carved from rare burled walnut, and the barrel was longer than standard, designed for extreme accuracy at extended ranges. The wolves came at midnight, just as Morrison had predicted. Samuel watched from the house, his own rifle ready, but knowing he was outclassed. Through the window, he could see shadows moving across the moonlit pasture with deadly purpose. The pack had learned to approach from multiple directions, with some members creating diversions while others went for the cattle. Morrison's first shot shattered the night silence like thunder. Samuel saw one of the wolves spin and drop near. The water trough, its spine severed by the perfectly placed bullet. The rest of the pack scattered immediately, but Morrison was already working the bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering another round. His second shot took down a juvenile that had been trying to drag the alpha's body away. The third scattered 2 adults who had been attempting to flank the barn. By morning, 3 wolves lay dead, and Morrison was already planning his next move. "They'll be more cautious now," he explained to Samuel as they examined the bodies in the early light. "But they'll also be angry. Pack animals don't like leaving their dead behind. It goes against their instincts." They'll try to retrieve these bodies, and when they do, I'll be ready. For the next week, Morrison and the wolves engaged in a deadly game of chess played across the Montana prairie. The hunter changed his tactics nightly, sometimes using the ranch buildings as cover, other times positioning himself in the open grassland with carefully constructed blinds made from tumbleweeds and buffalo grass. The wolves adapted quickly, splitting into smaller groups and attacking from unexpected directions. They learned to avoid Morrison's obvious positions, forcing him to think several moves ahead in their lethal dance. On the 8th night, they nearly got him. Morrison had positioned himself near the creek, expecting the wolves to approach from the north as they had the previous evening. Instead, they came from 3 directions simultaneously, with the alpha female leading a direct assault while her mate and another adult circled behind. Samuel, watching from the house, saw Morrison's muzzle flash twice in rapid succession, dropping the 2 flanking wolves. But the alpha female kept coming, her powerful legs carrying her across the ground in great bounds that ate up the distance between them with terrifying speed. Morrison rolled aside at the last possible moment, the she-wolf's snapping jaws passing within inches of his throat. His 3rd shot, fired from prone position, took her through the chest at point-blank range, but the victory came at a cost. In the confusion of the attack, 2 more cattle had been killed by the remaining pack members, a coordinated assault that demonstrated tactical thinking Samuel hadn't believed possible in animals. "They're learning," Morrison admitted the next morning as he bandaged a deep gash on his forearm where the female's claws had found their mark. "And they're getting desperate. That makes them infinitely more dangerous." Martha tended to his wound with gentle efficiency, her movements sure and practiced from years of dealing with ranch injuries. "How many are left?" 3 adults and a juvenile. "But the alpha male is still alive, and he's the most dangerous of the lot." Morrison winced as she applied iodine to the wound. "I've seen pack leaders like him before. They take losses personal, turn hunting into vengeance." Tommy, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him. "Mr. Morrison, what happens if you can't get them all?" Morrison looked at the boy for a long moment before answering, "Son, in my line of work, failure usually means death, either yours or the folks you're trying to protect. I don't plan on failing." The remaining wolves disappeared for 3 days, leaving no tracks, no sign, no indication they were still in the area. Samuel began to hope they had moved on to easier territory, but Morrison knew better. "They're watching," he told Samuel as they stood in the ranch yard, studying the surrounding hills through Morrison's field glasses. "The alpha's trying to understand my patterns, figure out my weaknesses. He's planning something." On the 4th night, Morrison's instincts proved correct in the most terrifying way possible. Samuel was awakened by Emma's screaming. He bolted upright, instantly alert, and realized the screams were coming from outside the house. Heart hammering, he grabbed his rifle and rushed to the window, Martha close behind him. What he saw turned his blood to ice water. Emma had apparently gotten up for a drink of water and stepped onto the back porch. Now she stood frozen in terror as the massive alpha male wolf stalked toward her across the yard, his yellow eyes fixed on her small form with predatory intensity. The wolf had somehow gotten between Emma and the house, cutting off her retreat. Every instinct in Samuel's body screamed at him to rush outside, but he knew that would only spook the animal into attacking immediately. A rifle shot cracked from the direction of the barn, and bark exploded from the porch post inches from the wolf's head. The alpha spun toward the source of the shot, snarling with rage, and Samuel saw his chance. "Emma, run to Papa now!" The little girl found her legs and sprinted toward the house as Samuel threw open the door. He scooped her up in his arms just as Morrison's second shot took the wolf through the shoulder, spinning the massive animal around, but not dropping him. The alpha, wounded and furious, charged toward the barn where Morrison's muzzle flash had given away his position. But the hunter was already moving, rolling out of the hayloft and dropping to ground level as the wolf crashed into the barn wall where he had been moments before. Morrison's third shot, fired from kneeling position at 30 yards, finally ended the alpha's reign of terror. The massive wolf collapsed in the barn doorway, his body twitching once before going still. Samuel held his daughter close, feeling her small body shake with residual terror. "It's over, sweetheart. The bad wolf can't hurt you anymore." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. 3 wolves remained, and now they had witnessed their leader's death. Morrison had warned him. This was no longer about territory or food. This was about vengeance. The death of the alpha male changed everything. The surviving wolves, now led by a scarred beta male Morrison had dubbed Scarface, abandoned their previous patterns entirely and began actively hunting the hunter. For 2 weeks, they stalked Morrison with the patience and cunning of human adversaries. They learned his routines, anticipated his movements, and twice nearly succeeded in ambushing him. The hunter found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, never able to relax his vigilance. "They're not acting like wolves anymore," Morrison confided to Samuel as they sat in the barn, cleaning their weapons. "It's like they've declared war on me personally." The psychological pressure was taking its toll. Morrison's eyes had developed a haunted quality, and his movements carried the twitchy alertness of a man who knew death could come from any direction. He barely slept, taking only brief naps during daylight hours when wolves were less likely to attack. Samuel found himself developing a grudging respect for the man who had risked everything to protect his family. Morrison could have declared the job finished after killing the alpha. Most of his payment would have been earned. Instead, he remained committed to eliminating every member of the pack, understanding that leaving survivors would only postpone the inevitable reckoning. The breakthrough came when Tommy discovered wolf tracks near the old line shack, a forgotten building from the ranch's earliest days that sat in a grove of cottonwoods about 2 miles from the main house. "They're using it as a den," Morrison realized as he studied the tracks. "Scarface has moved his remaining pack there, probably planning to wait me out until I give up and move on." That evening, Morrison announced his plan to end the hunt once and for all. "I'm going to force them into the open," he told Samuel, as they prepared for what both men knew would be the final confrontation. "The line shack has only one entrance, which means they're trapped if I can get positioned correctly. But I'll need help, someone to create a distraction while I get into position." Samuel's blood ran cold. "You want me to be the bait?" "I want you to help me finish this," Morrison corrected. "Your family will never be safe as long as those wolves are alive. They've tasted human territory now, learned that we can be beaten. Even if they move on temporarily, they'll be back." Martha overheard the conversation from the kitchen, and her face went white. "Samuel, no. You're not a gunfighter. This is suicide." "But—" Samuel looked at his children, Emma still having nightmares about the wolf on the porch, Tommy trying to be brave but jumping at every shadow, and knew Morrison was right. This had to end. "What do you need me to do?" The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Samuel would approach the line shack from the south, making enough noise to draw the wolves' attention and hopefully drive them out into the open, where Morrison would be waiting with his rifle. They moved out before dawn, traveling on foot to avoid the sound of horses. Morrison had spent the previous day scouting the area and had identified the perfect shooting position, a rocky outcrop about 200 yards from the shack that offered clear fields of fire and adequate cover. "Give me 30 minutes to get into position," Morrison instructed as they crouched in the pre-dawn darkness. "Then start making your approach. Walk normal. Don't try to be quiet. I want them to know you're coming." Samuel nodded, his mouth dry. With fear and anticipation, he carried his Springfield rifle, though both men knew it was more for psychological comfort than practical use. If the plan went wrong, if Morrison missed, or if the wolves split up, Samuel's life would depend on his ability to get back to cover. The 30 minutes seemed to crawl by with agonizing slowness. Samuel found himself thinking about Martha, about the children, about all the things he should have said but had never found the words for. If he died today, would they understand he had done it out of love? Finally, it was time. Samuel began his approach through the cottonwood grove, his boots crunching on fallen leaves with sounds that seemed to echo like gunshots in the morning stillness. Behind him, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The line shack sat in a small clearing, its weathered boards grey with age and neglect. To Samuel's eye, it looked innocent enough. Just another abandoned building slowly returning to the earth. But he knew that 3 of nature's most efficient killers waited inside, their senses attuned to his every movement. He was 50 yards from the shack when the first wolf emerged. Scarface stepped into the doorway like a king surveying his domain, his massive head turning slowly as he located the source of the approaching footsteps. Even at a distance, Samuel could see the intelligence in those yellow eyes, the cold calculation of a predator evaluating potential prey. The beta male was followed by a lean female with notched ears, one of the original pack members who had learned caution through bitter experience. The third wolf, a juvenile from the previous spring, remained partially concealed in the shadows of the doorway. For a long moment, predators and prey studied each other across the clearing. Samuel fought the urge to raise his rifle, knowing that any aggressive movement would trigger an immediate attack. According to the plan, he needed to draw them away from the shack, into Morrison's killing field. He took another step forward, then another. Scarface's ears went flat against his skull, a clear sign of aggression. The female began to circle to the left, trying to get behind him. The juvenile remained by the door, probably acting as backup in case the first assault failed. Samuel was beginning to think the plan had worked when everything went wrong. Instead of charging directly at him, Scarface suddenly wheeled around and bounded toward the rocks where Morrison lay hidden. Somehow, the wolf had detected the hunter's scent or caught the glint of sunlight off his rifle barrel. The female immediately followed her leader, leaving Samuel forgotten in the clearing. Morrison's rifle boomed twice in rapid succession, the shots echoing off the surrounding hills. Samuel saw Scarface stumble but keep coming, blood streaming from a wound in his shoulder. The female yelped and went down hard, Morrison's second shot taking her through the spine. But Scarface was still moving, still dangerous, and Morrison was frantically working his bolt action to chamber another round. The wounded wolf launched himself up the rocky slope with desperate fury, his powerful muscles carrying him toward the hunter despite his injuries. Samuel didn't think. He just reacted. Raising his Springfield, he fired at the charging wolf, his bullet taking Scarface through the ribs and spinning him around. It wasn't a killing shot, but it bought Morrison the seconds he needed to finish the job. The hunter's third shot took the wolf through the head, dropping him instantly. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stood in the clearing, his rifle smoking, hardly able to believe they had survived. Then he remembered the juvenile, but when he looked back at the line shack, the doorway was empty. The youngest member of the pack had vanished into the wilderness, probably fleeing at the first sound of gunfire. Morrison appeared at Samuel's shoulder, his grey eyes scanning the tree line. "Think he'll come back?" Samuel asked. Morrison shook his head. "Juveniles that lose their pack usually die within a few weeks. He's got no hunting experience, no territorial knowledge. The wilderness will finish what we started." The ride back to the ranch felt like a victory parade, though both men were too exhausted to celebrate. Samuel found himself looking at Morrison with new eyes, not just as a hired gun, but as a man who had risked his life repeatedly to protect a family he barely knew. Martha was waiting on the porch when they topped the last hill, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun as she watched their approach. The children flanked her, Emma clutching her cornhusk doll and Tommy trying to look grown up despite his obvious relief. "Is it over?" Martha called out when they were close enough to hear. "It's over," Samuel replied, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for weeks. That evening, the Hartwells held their first peaceful family dinner in over a month. Morrison joined them at Martha's insistence, though the taciturn hunter seemed uncomfortable with domestic tranquility. He sat at their rough-hewn table, eating Martha's fried chicken and biscuits, while Emma chatted about her plans for her upcoming birthday party. "Mr. Morrison," she said with the directness of childhood, "are you gonna stay and be our friend?" Morrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at the little girl who had nearly been his failure, his one fatal mistake. "I'm afraid I have to move on, little miss. There are other folks out there who need help with their wolf problems." "But where will you sleep? Don't you have a family?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps, and Samuel saw something flicker in Morrison's eyes, loneliness perhaps, or regret for choices made long ago. "My horse is my home," Morrison said finally, "and my rifle is my family." Later, after the children had been put to bed, Samuel and Morrison sat on the porch settling their accounts. Samuel counted out the remaining $50, money he could barely afford to spare, but payment gladly given for the return of peace. "You did more than just kill wolves," Samuel said as he handed over the bills. "You gave me back my family's future." Morrison pocketed the money without counting it. "A man's got a right to protect what's his, Mr. Hartwell. Sometimes he just needs help remembering how." "Will we see you again?" Morrison stood and adjusted his hat, his movements already suggesting departure. "This is a big territory and there's always someone having trouble with predators. But if you ever need help again—" He paused, seeming to struggle with unaccustomed sentiment. "Well, you know how to find me." Jack Morrison rode out the next morning as the sun painted the eastern sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Samuel watched him go with mixed feelings, relief that the threat was over, but also a strange sadness at losing the companionship of a man who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Martha joined him on the porch, slipping her arm through his as they watched the black speck that was Morrison disappear into the vast landscape. "Think we'll see him again?" she asked. "Hope we won't need to," Samuel replied, "but if we do, I suspect he'll come." The weeks that followed were a revelation. Without the constant threat of wolf attacks, Samuel's surviving cattle thrived on the autumn grass. He was able to purchase additional breeding stock from a rancher near Helena, and by winter the herd was larger than it had ever been. The banknote was paid in full with money left over for improvements. Samuel installed a new windmill, expanded the barn, and even bought Martha the sewing machine she had been wanting for 3 years. Tommy grew into his responsibilities, taking over much of the daily cattle management, while Emma started school. In town, riding back and forth with the Mitchell children from the neighboring ranch, but it was the stories that truly marked the change in their lives. Word of Morrison's success spread throughout Lewis County and beyond. Other ranchers, other farmers, other families plagued by predators began making the pilgrimage to the Hartwell Ranch, seeking information about the legendary wolf hunter. Samuel found himself telling and retelling the story, each version growing, slightly in the telling as frontier legends always did. "Is it true he killed the alpha with a single shot from 300 yards? Asked Jim Patterson, whose spread bordered Devil's Canyon. "Is it true he once faced down a whole pack with nothing but a knife?" wondered Sarah Mitchell, whose husband was considering hiring Morrison to deal with mountain lions. Samuel answered their questions as honestly as he could, but he understood that the truth was less important than what the story represented. In a land where law existed mainly in the hearts of good men and the barrels of their guns, Morrison had become a symbol, proof that the darkness could be held at bay, that families could be protected, that justice was still possible, even in the most remote corners of the frontier. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Montana Territory in snow that would last until April. The Hartwells spent the long months in comparative comfort, their cattle safe in the expanded barn, their root cellar full of vegetables, their hearts at peace for the first time in years. But even as they enjoyed their domestic tranquility, stories of Jack Morrison continued to filter back from across the territory. He had been seen in Billings, hunting a rogue grizzly that had killed 2 prospectors. Someone claimed he had tracked cattle thieves all the way to the Canadian border and brought them back tied across their own saddles. A saloon keeper in Miles City swore Morrison had faced down 3 armed men in a dispute over a card game, walking away unscathed while his opponents required the doctor's attention. Samuel took these stories with appropriate skepticism. He knew how frontier legends grew in the telling, but he also knew that Morrison's reputation was built on genuine skill and unwavering courage. Somewhere out there, the grey-eyed hunter was still riding his solitary circuit, still answering the calls of desperate families, still standing between the innocent and the predators that would devour them. Spring brought its own revelations. As the snow melted and Samuel rode out to check his cattle, he discovered something that made him pause and smile. In a sheltered valley near the old line shack, where Scarface had made his final stand, new grass was growing in patterns that hadn't been there before. The wolves, in their constant movement back and forth across the land, had unknowingly spread seeds that had taken root and flourished. Life, Samuel reflected, had a way of finding balance. The wolves had been killers, destroyers of his dreams and threats to his family's safety, but they had also been part of the natural order, creatures following their instincts in a harsh and unforgiving world. Morrison had done what was necessary to protect human life and property, but Samuel found he could appreciate the wolves' fierce dedication to their pack, their willingness to fight to the death for their territory. In the end, it wasn't about good and evil. It was about survival, adaptation, and the eternal struggle between wilderness and civilization. 3 years passed before Samuel saw Jack Morrison again. It was a hot July afternoon in 1885, and Samuel was working on repairs to his windmill when he spotted a familiar figure riding across the prairie. Even at a distance, Morrison's posture was unmistakable, that easy grace in the saddle that spoke of countless miles traveled and dangers faced. But as the rider drew closer, Samuel could see that the years had left their mark. Morrison's hair was grayer at the temples, his face more deeply lined by sun and wind. There was a weariness in his movements that suggested more than physical fatigue. "Mr. Morrison!" Emma called from the porch, where she sat reading a book from the new schoolteacher's library. At 10, she had grown into a bright, confident girl who showed no lingering fear from her encounter with the alpha wolf. "Papa, it's Mr. Morrison!" The hunter dismounted and accepted Martha's invitation to supper with the same quiet dignity Samuel remembered. Over fried steak and fresh corn, Morrison brought them up to date on his wanderings, the grizzly in Yellowstone, that had taken him 3 weeks to track down, the pack of feral dogs that had been terrorizing homesteaders near the Dakota border, the mountain lions that had killed a child in a mining camp west of Helena. "Seems like there's more predators than ever," Morrison said, accepting a second helping of Martha's apple pie. "Or maybe just more people moving into their territory." "What brings you back our way?" Samuel asked, though he thought he could guess. Morrison didn't make social calls. "Got word, there's a new pack working the area around Judith Basin. Different than the ones I dealt with here. These are cattle killers, pure and simple. Taking down full-grown steers and leaving the meat to rot. The ranchers up there are offering good money to anyone who can stop them. Samuel nodded, understanding. Morrison was a professional, always following the work. But he sensed there was more to this visit than business. After supper, as Martha put the children to bed, Samuel and Morrison sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. The familiar sounds of a peaceful ranch evening surrounded them. Cattle lowing softly in the distance, horses shifting in the corral, the whisper of wind through the grass. "You know," Morrison said after a long silence, "I've been thinking about what you said 3 years ago, about giving you back your family's future." Samuel waited, sensing the hunter had more to say. "Thing is, Mr. Hartwell, I never had much of a future to lose. Been drifting since I was 16, living job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." Morrison's voice was quiet, reflective. "Watching your family these past few days, it's made me wonder what I might have missed." "It's not too late," Samuel said carefully. "A man can change his path if he's willing to try." Morrison smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Maybe for some men, but I've got blood on my hands, Mr. Hartwell. More than you know. The wolves were just the latest in a long line of killing that started during the war and never really ended. The war's been over for 20 years. Not for men like me." Morrison stood and walked to the porch rail, his hands gripping the wood as he stared out into the gathering darkness. "I've killed 17 men, Mr. Hartwell. Some in uniform, some not. All of them had families somewhere, people who loved them and waited for them to come home." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was the first time Morrison had revealed anything about his past, and Samuel wasn't sure he wanted to hear more. "Self-defense," he asked quietly. "Some, others." Morrison shrugged. "The line gets blurry when killing becomes your trade. I tell myself I only hunt animals now, but sometimes I wonder if there's really any difference." "There's a difference," Samuel said firmly. "You saved my family. You've saved others. That has to count for something." Morrison turned back toward him, and in the lamplight from the house, Samuel could see the weight of years and choices in those grey eyes. "I'd like to think so. But tomorrow I ride north to kill more wolves, and after that there'll be another job, another pack, another family in need. It never ends, Mr. Hartwell, and I'm getting tired." "Then stop." The words hung between them like a challenge. Morrison stared at Samuel for a long moment, then shook his head. "Can't. It's who I am. It's what you do. There's a difference, but—" Morrison was already stepping down from the porch, his decision made. "I'll be moving on before dawn. Don't want to wake the children." Samuel stood as well, understanding that this might be the last time he saw the man who had become both savior and symbol in his family's story. "Morrison," he called as the hunter reached his horse, "if you ever decide you want something different, there's always a place for you here. Martha and I talked about it. The spread's getting bigger, and I could use help managing it." Morrison. He paused with his hand on the saddle, and for a moment Samuel thought he might turn around. Instead, he swung up onto his horse with fluid grace. "Appreciate the offer, Mr. Hartwell, but wolves don't hunt themselves." He rode away into the darkness, leaving Samuel alone on the porch with the weight of unfinished conversations and roads not taken. Samuel never saw Jack Morrison again, but the stories continued to reach him. Morrison was killed in the winter of 1887, according to a letter from Sheriff Coleman. He had been tracking a pack of wolves near the Crazy Mountains when a blizzard caught him in the open. They found his body 3 days later, frozen in his bedroll with his rifle beside him. The wolves he had been hunting were found dead nearby. Apparently, he had completed his final contract even as the storm took his life. Samuel read the letter twice, then walked out to the barn where he sat alone for nearly an hour, remembering the grey-eyed hunter who had saved his family and then disappeared back into the wilderness that had shaped him. That evening, he gathered his children around the fireplace and told them about Jack Morrison one last time. Emma, now 13 and preparing for her first teaching position, listened with the attention of someone who understood they were hearing history. Tommy, 18 and managing most of the ranch operations, asked practical questions about Morrison's tactics and techniques. But Samuel could see in his son's eyes the same fascination that had gripped him during Morrison's visits. "Was he a good man, Papa?" Emma asked when the story was finished. Samuel considered the question carefully. "He was a necessary man, sweetheart. In a hard land, sometimes you need hard men to stand between families and the darkness. Morrison did what had to be done, even when it cost him pieces of his soul. Will there always be men like him? I hope." "So," Samuel said quietly, "because there will always be wolves." The years passed, and the frontier began to change. Railroads brought civilization deeper into the wilderness. Towns grew into cities, territories became states, and the vast empty spaces that had once sheltered both predators and protectors gradually filled with families seeking their own piece of the American dream. Samuel lived to see the turn of the century, watching his children grow up and have children of their own. Tommy took over the ranch and expanded it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Montana. Emma became a teacher, then a principal, and finally the superintendent of schools for Lewis County. But they never forgot the story of the wolf hunter. It became part of the family legend, passed down through generations with the kind of reverence usually reserved for scripture. Great-grandchildren who had never seen a wolf, never known the terror of predators stalking through the night, still listened wide-eyed to the tale of the gray-eyed man who had saved their family's future. The story grew in the telling as frontier. Legends always did. Morrison became larger than life, his skills more supernatural, his courage more absolute. Some versions had him killing a dozen wolves with a dozen shots. Others claimed he could track a single wolf across solid rock. All agreed that he was the finest hunter who ever lived, a man who could speak the language of the wild and bend it to his will. But Samuel, when he was very old and his memory for recent events had begun to fade, could still recall with perfect clarity the quiet man who had sat at his table, eaten his wife's cooking, and treated his children with unexpected gentleness. That Morrison, tired, haunted by his past, searching for something he couldn't name, was more real and more heroic than any legend. Epilogue. The spirit endures. In 1924, nearly 40 years after Morrison's death, Samuel's great-grandson found an old leather journal while cleaning out the attic of the original ranch house. The journal had belonged to Jack Morrison, apparently left behind after one of his visits and forgotten until now. The entries were brief, written in a careful hand that spoke of limited education but keen intelligence. October 15th, 1882. Finished. Job at Hartwell Ranch. 7 wolves dead. Family safe. Good people. Reminded me of what I might have been if I'd chosen different. October 16th, 1882. Rode north toward Judith Basin. New pack reported. Always another pack, always another job. Sometimes wonder what it would be like to stay in one place long enough to watch the seasons change. October 20th, 1882. Made camp by Musselshell River. Dreamed again about the Hartwell place. Mrs. H. Apple pie. Little Emma asking if I had a family. Maybe I do in a way. Maybe that's enough. The journal contained dozens of similar entries spanning the years between Morrison's visits to the ranch. They painted a picture of a man torn between duty and desire, between the wilderness that had shaped him and the civilization he protected but could never quite join. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. December 10th, 1887. Storm coming in from the north. Pack is close, maybe 3 miles ahead. If I can reach them before the weather hits, this will be finished by morning. If not, well, every man's got to meet his end somewhere. Could do worse than dying in the pursuit of something worthwhile. Samuel's great-grandson donated the journal to the Montana Historical Society, where it joined other artifacts from the territory's frontier period. But the real legacy of Jack Morrison lived on in the stories, in the memories of families he had helped, in the understanding that in the darkest hours there had been those willing to ride into the night and face whatever dangers lurked there. The West had been won not by armies or governments, but by individuals. Farmers like Samuel Hartwell, who refused to surrender their dreams, hunters like Jack Morrison, who stood guard against the darkness, families who built something lasting from the raw materials of courage and determination. The wolves were gone now, hunted to near extinction by men like Morrison and the advancing tide of civilization. The vast prairies had been carved into sections by barbed wire and railroad tracks. The frontier itself had officially closed, according to government census takers, but the spirit that had driven Samuel to defend his family and Morrison to answer that call, that spirit endured. It lived on in every person who refused to surrender, to fear, who stood up for what was right regardless of the cost, who understood that freedom and safety were not gifts, but responsibilities that each generation must earn anew. In the end, the wolves may have tested the strength of man, but it was the heart of a cowboy and the hearts of all who stood with him that decided the fate of the land. The legend of the wolf hunter would live forever, carried forward by the wind across the endless plains, a reminder that heroes were not born but made, forged in the crucible of necessity and tempered by the willingness to do what must be done. Frontier was gone, but its lessons remained, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough, that civilization was worth defending, and that somewhere, always, there were those ready to ride out and meet the darkness with steady hands and unshakable resolve. The story of Jack Morrison and Samuel Hartwell had become part of the American epic, a testament to the enduring power of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged between strangers who stand together against the night. In the vast silence of the Montana prairie, where the wind still whispers through the grass and the stars shine down on empty spaces that once rang with the sound of gunfire and the howl of wolves, the legend lives on, not as history, but as promise. A promise that when evil rises and good people are threatened, there will always be those willing to take up arms in defense of the innocent. The wolf hunter rides still in the hearts of all who refuse to let the darkness win.